Hello and welcome to a tutorial on BattleMetrics trigger counters. A counter, you might be asking, what is that? A counter does just that, it counts. When you use a counter as an action, every time a player does whatever you say they are meant to have done, like a player report or used a bad word in chat, any of those things, the counter will tick up. You can use this for gradual rule enforcement, you can use it for threshold rule enforcement. So if you want to warn a player on the first instance of something happening, you can do that and then ban them on the second or the third. Counters allow you to do that. Similarly, if you just want to have a threshold set where if the player gets reported by another player 3 times or more, then you take some action like a flag, ban, or whatever you want. So to get started with the trigger system and counters, you gotta, of course, go to the trigger section. We're gonna go to the create trigger button up here at the upper right. We're going to select our organization. We're going to look for that, just for our purposes, we're going to look for a player report trigger, because we're looking at Rust F7 player reports. We're going to call this the Rust player report trigger. Then we're going to leave a condition section blank, because I want this to run an action every single time that there's a player report, and you'll see why here in a second. Now, when I'm using a counter, the first thing that I have to do is to create the counter, because you can't reference something that doesn't exist yet. So we're going to look for counters, and we're going to add that as an action. Now we're going to name the counter of player report counter, and then we have to choose the scope. Now the scope of a counter basically tells the counter what it should be looking at. Now you have 3 options when you're doing a scope. You have the server, the player, and the session. The server scope doesn't really apply to this type of trigger, but it'll basically track, regardless of the players, it'll track the server. So let's say you want to have a counter set to the player count of the server or to some server-specific variable or event. That's when you're going to want the server scope. When you're looking at the player scope, that's when we want to track the player across the different servers in your organization. So if you have, say, 4 servers and you want to make sure that this player isn't breaking the same rule across all 4 servers, you're going to have that counter track them across the organization. Then you have the session scope. Now, a session is when a player connects and then disconnects from a server. That's a session. So if they connect at noon and they disconnect at 1 p.m., that's one session. If they then come back at 2 p.m., that's a new session, and the counter won't remember anything from the 12 to 1 session that you had earlier. So if you want to make sure that you're tracking the player across all events, then the player scope is going to be what we're looking for. Then you have to choose a duration, which is basically telling the counter how far back is it going to be remembering its occurrences. So here I'm going to set it for a week, but you can choose anything up to 30 days essentially. So then I'm going to select my servers. There's only 1 in this test organization, so we're going to create that trigger. All right, based on that. But we're not done yet, because all we've got set up is a counter so far. Now we have to have an action that uses the counter. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to flag any player that reaches a player report threshold. Let's say 1. They get 1 report. I'm going to add a flag. So I'm going to make sure that I always add the flag, even if it's previously been removed, because we want to make sure we're always up to date with the players' reports. Now I'm going to create a new flag, which I'm going to call player report. And I'm just going to select a little alert icon. You can choose whatever color you want from the menu, but we're just going to leave it as red. We're going to save that. All right, that's done. Now we have to condition adding the player flag to only certain times that the counter reaches certain values, because I don't want this to be added every single time that they get reported, only on the first time. So I'm going to toggle the action condition, which is listed right up here. It's this little blue button, and I'm going to reference the counter in the condition. So I'm going to say counter player report counter is equal to 1. So I only want the player flag the first time that this person gets reported. After that, I don't want any additional flags. So just equal to 1. Now, let's assume that the player gets reported 5 times in a week. I'm going to then kick that player. All right, let's assume that the person gets 5 reports in a week. So again, I have to create the kick player action. I have to choose the toggle action condition again, and I need to reference the counter again. I'm going to say greater than 4. That way, if there's more than 5, if there's 5 or more reports in a week, we're just going to kick the player. And we can even go further than this. We can say, let's ban the person if they reach a certain number. We're going to say add BattleMetrics ban as an action. We're going to go down. We're going to toggle the action condition again. We're going to reference that counter. And we're going to say only when it's greater than, say, 6. If they reach 7 reports in a week, then we're going to ban them. We're going to reference the ban list. We're going to say too many reports as our ban reason. We're going to say they're permabanned. We'll let them appeal it out. And we're only going to ban the Steam ID for our purposes. So this is one example of trigger structure that you can create using counters. This is the gradual enforcement levels. So you can see the counter action runs every single time that the player report evaluates. Then we take other actions based on the value of that counter. So when they reach the threshold of 1, they get a player flag. If they get 5 or more, they get kicked. And if they have a count of 7 or more, then they get banned. And so that's one way that you can do it. Now, I do recommend that when you're using these triggers that you don't take actions like kick or ban right off the bat. I'm just showing you as something you can do, not something you should do when you're building a new trigger. For your purposes, you're probably going to want your trigger just to look like the flag, or you're going to want some other action that is non-consequential, because if you set your trigger up incorrectly, you could kick or ban your entire server. And so you want to make sure that you know exactly what this trigger is going to do before you give it a action of greater consequence. So I highly recommend that you use something like player flag, notification, or something like a log action in order to avoid having adverse outcomes. So for this, I'm just going to change it to greater than 1, or actually we'll change that to greater than 0. That way we get it on the first occurrence, and we'll just have a flag and let our server admins moderate that from there, regardless of taking any other action. So when I'm done and satisfied, I'll hit create trigger, and then I get a little confirmation screen and a index of the ones that we've created. Now, if we want to go back and modify that, we can. We can just go back in and add actions again. You know, we can change the way that this trigger works. So I hope that's been a good lesson on player counters. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us in the BattleMetrics Discord for trigger-specific support. So thank you, and enjoy.